Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Today I want to take a crack at answering a question I raised quite a few episodes ago, actually, when we were going through Plato's greatest work on love and desire, the Symposium. You might remember in that work, the prophetess Diotima, who I think we can understand to be, at least to some extent, Plato's mouthpiece, made this distinction between these two senses of eros, the narrow sense of romantic or sexual love or desire, and a wider sense. And she told us that eros, in this wider sense, which seems to be her main concern in this dialogue, is for nothing but the good. And she gave us examples of these various non-sexual, non-romantic human pursuits and obsessions that are all, she said, manifestations of eros in this wider sense. And so it's clear that for Diotima, and hence presumably for Plato, eros in this wider sense, the sense I think we can say that is of the most interest to philosophers, is not just one form of love or desire, but love or desire as such. And it's worth mentioning here, I think, that in using this word to denote human love and desire as such, Plato lays the foundation for this entire centuries-long tradition of Platonism and Neoplatonism in its various incarnations. We've seen, for example, Augustine pick up this tradition by, in a way, privileging the term amor in his writings, the closest Latin equivalent to eros, and talking about it as the sole motor of the psyche, even though he knew this would make people feel uncomfortable in theological contexts. Because, of course, for Augustine, amor is a force that does not find rest, ultimately, in anything but union with God. And we see the Greek fathers of the Christian church write similarly of human desire, including desire for God, using this word eros. Meanwhile, we have this tradition taken up in the Islamic world by thinkers such as Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as he's been traditionally more commonly known in the West, one of the great interpreters of Plato, who speaks of the love of God using this Arabic term ishq, which normally denotes passionate love. And then, of course, we have this theme taken up by Marsilio Ficino and so many others. But, of course, this sexualization of the vocabulary of love and desire in the Platonic tradition goes way beyond this choice of the word eros and its equivalents in other languages. It's really one of the hallmarks of the whole tradition to use the language of sex and sexual infatuation to convey the great underlying Platonic quest, the quest for the one which is at once ethical, intellectual, aesthetic, eudaimonic. It's a quest for happiness, or you could say it's both ethical and eudaimonic, perhaps, the quest for the objective and subjective good. And if you like, spiritual, if you want to use the language of religion for this. I've talked before, for example, about the tendency in this tradition to punningly use words in passages talking about this quest that also have sexual meanings, like synousia, literally being with, but also, depending on the context, communion of the kind one has with gods, in prayer, for example, in rites, and also with other humans in sexual intercourse. Plotinus's famous tractate on beauty, which seems to have exerted such an influence on St. Augustine, is a passage where we see this conflation especially intensely, I think. And it also figures quite prominently in the very last tractate of the Enneads. And speaking of Augustine, we have this striking passage from Book 10 of his Confessions, where, addressing God as he does throughout the whole work, he writes, "You were fragrant, and I drew in my breath, and now pant after you. I tasted you, and I feel but hunger and thirst for you. You touched me, and I am set on fire to attain the peace which is yours." And the note to that passage, of which I've quoted only a small section, by translator Henry Chadwick reads, "Augustine's Latin in this chapter is a work of high art, with rhymes and poetic rhythms not reproducible in translation. He is fusing imagery from the Song of Solomon with Neoplatonic reflection on Plato's Phaedrus and Symposium, and simultaneously summarizing the central themes of the Confessions." And so the question, I think, must then arise from all this. Why are Plato and his followers so fond of the word eros? Why does he feel it necessary to develop this wide, all-encompassing sense of it? Why not just, or when he does that, why not just stick to a more conventional word for desire? And why all this sexual vocabulary generally? Is there a desire to, for some reason, sexualize the quest of the psyche here? Of course, we don't have to read much of the Platonic writings to know that this tradition did not see the psychic, or if you like, spiritual quest as identical with the sexual one, which it saw as narrower. And there's a particularly powerful anecdote to illustrate this point from the life of Plotinus. It's this biography that the Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyry, who was Plotinus's student, wrote of his teacher. At one point, Porphyry writes, a rhetor named Diophanes read out to a gathering of Plotinus and his students an argument that, quote, "As a price for an education in virtue, a pupil should make himself sexually available if his teacher wanted it," unquote. And I think it goes without saying that this arrangement, with its likely very considerable gap in age and power, is likely to strike most of us as quite repugnant, if not actually likely to work some kind of psychological harm on the young student. And so it's likely to take us aback if we assume that our own notions of sexual exploitation and trauma have been universal in human history, because they haven't. I think it's likely to surprise us in another way also, if we have much familiarity with Platonism and Neoplatonism at all. A repeated theme in these writers, of course, is the idea, which I keep calling subversive, that objectification is ultimately a hindrance to the satisfaction of human desire, that our desire will be frustrated as long as we continue to go after beautiful things instead of that absolute beauty, which is also the absolute good and absolute unity of being, the buried memory of which our encounters with these beautiful things triggers in us. So it kind of takes us aback to encounter a philosopher, presumably in the Platonic tradition, making this kind of argument, notwithstanding the way this type of relationship is occasionally spoken about in the Symposium and in other Platonic writings. But we'll see that Plotinus himself didn't think highly of Diophanes' argument here. But this theme that I just mentioned of objectification falling short of any ability to really satisfy our desire is repeated in these Platonic writings far too many times to mention in this video. But I think it's expressed especially wonderfully in Plotinus's treatise on beauty, rendered into English especially wonderfully by the great Irish translator of Plotinus, Stephen McKenna, whose translation influenced Yeats and perhaps also James Joyce, among others. And it goes like this: beholding this being, the choragos of all existence, the chorus leader of all existence. So he's talking about the one, or good, the self-intent that ever goes forth and never takes, resting, wrapped in the vision and possession of so lofty a loveliness, growing to its likeness. What beauty can the soul yet lack? For this, the beauty supreme, the absolute and the primal, fashions its lovers to beauty and makes them also worthy of love. And for this, the sternest and the uttermost combat is set before the souls, and our labor is for this, lest we be left without part in this noblest vision, which to attain is to be blessed in the blissful sight, which to fail of is to fail utterly. For not he that is failed of the joy that is in color or in visible forms, not he that has failed of power or of honors or of kingdom has failed, but only he that has failed of only this, for whose winning he should renounce kingdoms and command over earth and ocean and sky, if only, spurning the world of sense from beneath his feet and straining to this, he may see. But what must we do? How lies the path? How come to vision of the inaccessible beauty, dwelling as if in consecrated precincts, apart from the common ways, where all may see, even the profane? He that has the strength, let him arise and withdraw into himself, foregoing all that is known by the eyes, turning away forever from the material beauty that once made his joy. When he perceives these shapes, those shapes of grace that show in body, let him not pursue. He must know them for copies, vestiges, shadows, and hasten away towards that they tell of. So this is how the Platonic tradition sees objectification, you could say, including and perhaps especially sexual objectification, that although like all forms of desire, it always contains in itself some kind of marker or sign pointing to the absolute good, it is also, again like all forms of human desire, incomplete and ultimately frustrating as long as the psyche doesn't try to decode it. And so getting back to this gathering I mentioned earlier of Plotinus and his students, this anecdote that Porphyry tells us about, we perhaps shouldn't be surprised to hear that Plotinus seems also to have found the argument of Diophanes the rhetor repugnant. While Diophanes was reading it out, Porphyry tells us, quote, Plotinus started up several times to leave the room, but forced himself to remain. On the breaking up of the company, he directed me to write a refutation. Diophanes refused to lend me his address, and I had to depend on my recollection of his argument. But my refutation, delivered before the same audience, delighted Plotinus so much that during the very reading he repeatedly quoted, "So strike and be a light to men." And actually, the translation of Lloyd Gerson and his team renders this last part slightly different. They say that this is something that after this incident made sort of put Plotinus in the habit of shouting out whenever Porphyry was talking. And it's beyond my time, my capacity in terms of both time and probably expertise in Greek to adjudicate between these two readings. But anyway, Plotinus was quoting from Homer here, "So strike and be a light to men," just tweaking the quotation slightly. It's a scene in the Iliad, and actually the Gerson translation mistakenly attributes it to the Odyssey, actually, but it's from the Iliad, in which the Greek archer Toiker, or Toikros, son of the hero Telamon by his second wife, has killed several Trojans with his bow in quick succession. And it goes like this. I can't resist quoting it also. "Agamemnon, the lord of men, was glad as he watched him laying waste from the strong bow the Trojan battalions. He went over and stood beside him and spoke a word to him. 'Telamonian Toikros, dear heart, O Lord of your people, strike so, thus you may be a light given to the Danaans, and to Telamon your father, who cherished you when you were little, and bastard as you were,'" because that's how they considered, I guess, the son of a child of a second wife, "looked after you in his own house. Bring him into glory, though he is far away." And you can see how a Platonist like Plotinus would, you can imagine him bringing a theological reading to this passage, although we can assume that the Academy would not see that in Homer at all today. And by the, what else was I going to, oh yeah. Anyway, I think this anecdote illustrates an idea that I think is pretty easily inferable from other things Plato and the Platonists wrote about desire, that any blurring of the distinction between the sexual and psychic quests must mean a kind of psychic darkness, a darkness from which it is one of the tasks of philosophy to liberate the psyche. So then, to return to our question, why all this sexual language in the Platonic tradition? And here's what I think. Plato and those following in his tradition use sexual language for two reasons, the first of which I'll talk about today. And this comes down to the basic principle of the Platonic philosophy, at least in my opinion, and in the opinion of most of Plato's interpreters throughout history, though not necessarily to folks in the Academy today. And that's this idea that the good, the principal or ultimate object of all desire, is also the one, being in its absolute unity. And we can see how this would apply to the human good in all sorts of ways. All the good things we humans pursue, all these lesser goods, are also lesser unities, aren't they, really? Consuming is a kind of making one. I mean, in the case of eating, obviously one makes the other oneself. But even in any kind of acquiring, one, in a way, binds many things to oneself. One makes a kind of one out of many. And pleasure itself is a kind of oneness, you could say, with the fullness of nature. And displeasure is a kind of alienation from that fullness of nature. Like hunger, for example, is a kind of otherness that alerts us to the need to eat. Health is the unity or integrity of living bodies. And when animals die and decompose, what's happening really, of course, is that they're losing their unity. Everything just goes its own way. Power is a kind of absence of otherness, a state in which nothing seems to stand in one's way, and in which everything is, in a way, one's own. Human purpose is a kind of unity. It's something under which we bring all our actions. And of course, the goodness of love of all kinds, I think most of us would agree, lies in its transcendence of the distinction between self and other. One wants the good for the beloved other because one has sympathy with the other. To some extent, the boundary between self and other has sort of been erased or eroded or broken down in some way. But of all the forms of human love and desire, it's in sexual or romantic love or desire, I think, that the good, the object of desire, appears most powerfully as unity, and this in a number of ways. One of these, as we saw many episodes ago, was pointed out by Freud in the opening section of his Civilization and its Discontents, that in romantic attachment we see, again, this erasure of that division between self and other that I've just mentioned, but in particularly intense form. And to repeat Freud here, normally there's nothing of which we're more certain than the feeling of our self, of our own ego. This ego appears to us as something autonomous and unitary, marked off distinctly from everything else. There's only one state, admittedly an unusual state, but not one that can be stigmatized as pathological, in which it does not do this. At the height of being in love, the boundary between ego and object threatens to melt away. Against all the evidence of his senses, a man who is in love declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as if it were a fact. Actually, in romantic attachment or sexual desire, we find ourselves not just experiencing a kind of intense oneness, but also craving it with unusual intensity in ways that Freud doesn't really spell out here. I'm talking, of course, about the craving for physical union, the joining of bodies in intercourse. But then even beyond that, of course, there's the intense unity experienced in sexual climax, which, as we've noted in an earlier episode in this series, is at once different from, and yet in some ways strikingly similar to, the kind of climax experienced in mystical ecstasy, and may actually have physiological processes in common with it. And then finally, I don't think we should discount the role of beauty in sexual attraction and the role, in turn, of unity in beauty. There's the Platonic teaching on beauty, of course, and I think this is something we see especially in the Neoplatonists, is that it's intimately related to unity because the essence of beauty is harmony, and harmony is essentially proportion or ratio, and the principle of ratio is the principle of all number, and that is, of course, the unit or the one. So beauty, though this may seem a rather abstract way of conceiving it, is a kind of shining forth of unity. You could say in multiplicity. You could say unity appearing or governing in some way the flux of life that may otherwise seem just a jumble of an infinite multiplicity of items. And so all that to say that it's in sexual or romantic love and desire that unity seems to really pack a punch for us mortals. It would be impossible, I think, to find a more powerful example than in human sexuality of oneness appearing to us as the object of our desire, as unity manifesting itself in our desire, as unity, in other words, manifesting itself as the good. And so what we have here, I think, in the fondness of Platonists over centuries for words like eros and amor, ishq, to describe human desire as such, human desire culminating in desire for the good, the one, expressed in religious terms as God, is not a desire really to exalt sexuality or to sexualize the ethical quest, the intellectual quest, the aesthetic quest, the spiritual quest, but to convey in a way that's both powerful and subtle the idea of unity as the object of desire, the identity that is to say, of the good and the one. And so, in my opinion anyway, we have in this conflation of sexual and, if you like, spiritual vocabulary, more support for the idea that Plato saw the one and the good as the same, and probably, I think, taught it in the academy while refraining from being too explicit about it in his dialogues, because possibly he deemed it too subversive of traditional Greek religion, maybe even for his own safety and that of his students. So this is, in my view, one reason why the Platonists are so fond of using sexualized language. You may remember I also mentioned another reason, and this one is actually closely tied to the first. It's sort of another side of the first, the reason that I've just given. But it has more to do with what I also mentioned earlier, this question of how one actually realizes the good or the one in life. And that's what I hope to get into next time. I hope you can join me for that again. And until then, be well, and thanks for watching.